Today we're going to talk about micro four thirds versus full frame and why micro four thirds still might have an edge. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind the scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. When it comes to the conversation of micro four thirds versus full frame, there's a lot of factors at play and a lot of things people will constantly call out. You've got crop factor, field of view, depth of field, background, bokeh, blurry balls, all that stuff that people love to talk about in this conversation. But one thing that stands out to me with micro four thirds versus full frame is actually the aspect ratio of the sensor. This comes down to open gate production. When you're thinking about how you want to film, horizontal versus vertical, one of the key critical factors in that is open gate. If you know about open gate and the possibilities of filming this way, you'll understand probably what I'm getting to. Full frame sensors tend to be 3x2, which is slightly more horizontal than micro four thirds sensors, which are 4x3. And that tends to be a squarer, more tall sensor aspect ratio. And open gate means you're capturing all of that when you're recording video. So if you are trying to shoot horizontal and vertical content at the same time, micro four thirds actually gives you more vertical pixels to work with when you're shooting open gate compared to full frame sensors that again tend to be 3x2. Which is again a little bit more horizontal, a little bit closer to 16:9. It does give you a little bit more vertical pixels to work with if you're doing open gate. So don't get me wrong, it still is an advantage over traditional 16:9 if you're trying to do vertical content, but that 3x2 aspect ratio, that sensor is not as square as 4x3, and 4x3 isn't square, that would be 4x4, but it's pretty close. And a lot of people, if you're familiar, maybe you're unfamiliar, open gate, a lot of times people think anamorphic, thinking squeeze factor and all the fancy lenses they can put on there. But trust me, I've made plenty of videos about this. There's tons of them out there. If you can embrace open gate production, especially in today's day and age where you've got clients and projects that need vertical, horizontal, maybe they need square, maybe they need some strange aspect ratio for a vertical billboard or whatever it might be. If you can use open gate and really unlock that ability to shoot horizontal, vertical content all at the same time, maybe there are particular scenarios where you need to do a little reframing in post, but for the most part, if you're able to center frame most of your content, you can easily make horizontal and vertical content at the exact same time. And that extra edge that you get with micro four thirds, yeah, we can talk about, pixel density and noise and how big the photo sites are and resolution and depth of field and all that. That's all fine and good. And if you want to compare pixel peep, yeah, you might say full frame cameras still have the edge in terms of quality, but in terms of practical use functionality, micro four thirds, if you have more vertical pixels to work with, that tends to make the vertical content just feel that much better. You get a little bit more breathing room to work with compared to especially 16:9. If you're shooting 16:9 and cropping vertical, it's very rare that you're going to have a decent amount of headroom for your subject. And everything feels tight. It feels constrained, claustrophobic if you're cropping vertical from 16:9. 3x2, if you have a camera that can shoot open gate, get that whole sensor uncropped in video. Again, there's no disadvantage to doing this. A lot of people might think, well, you're just getting a different aspect ratio. What's the advantage? You're getting the true aspect ratio. If you're shooting 16:9 on any camera nowadays, chances are that sensor is a lot taller than that. Most times, if you're shooting full frame, it's probably going to be a 3x2 sensor. And by shooting 16:9 video, you're automatically cropping, you're baking that look in. It's the same thing as shooting raw photos versus JPEGs. A lot of times, if you're shooting raw, you'll get the uncropped full aspect ratio of that sensor, and all the cropping can be done in post. With video, you're baking in that 16:9, you're losing out on all those extra pixels that are above and below that crop line, and that open gate just gives you all that back. You have the full sensor recorded. But again, if you're shooting micro four thirds, that's a 4x3 aspect ratio. So you've got even more vertical room to play with. And again, it just makes those vertical videos look so much better, a little bit more breathable, not as claustrophobic, not as constrained and everything's tight and cropped in. It feels nice to have nice, open, tall vertical content. You can do it with 3x2. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of times I've used something like the S5 Mark II or the S9, both Lumix cameras, to shoot open gate. But 3x2, and every time I compare it to something like the GH7 or the G9 Mark II micro four third cameras, I'm always impressed by the extra pixels I get when it comes to 3x2. And it's not, it's not double or triple, anything crazy. It's just that extra little bit of breathing room that you can get out of Micro Four Thirds. And when you're looking at how all these files get exported and uploaded, most of the time when you're going to TikTok or Instagram or anywhere on social media, the resolution is way lower than what we're capturing, right? We're shooting 6K open gate on most of these cameras and exporting it, 1080p or something equivalent, very close to that for social media. But you've got the 6K to work with for your, your real video, your proper professional cinematic, whatever it is, your production. But you've also got this great vertical content. Again, no disadvantages to getting those extra pixels. Maybe the file sizes are a little bit bigger, but you're not losing anything. That's the main thing I always want to explain to people when shooting OpenGate. You're not losing anything. You're actually gaining back what you already have. Just imagine like you're baking in black bars, basically 16:9 on pretty much every camera. I don't think there's any cameras that have a 16:9 aspect ratio sensor. There may be a few of them. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but almost all these cameras, 3x2 sensor, and you're baking in the black bars. Think of it that way. If you're not shooting OpenGate, you're baking in black bars. You're letterboxing your footage right from the get-go. And you might not notice it because, yeah, you don't see the black bars. But if you think of it that way, it's kind of concerning. When you're, oh man, I'm not getting the most out of my camera. That's why it's so frustrating. All these camera companies that have still yet to embrace OpenGate, giving us even the option. There's a few out there, more than Lumix, but Lumix has been doing it for the longest, and I give them the most credit for just giving us these features in such affordable consumer-level cameras with incredible professional features. So you can do all this cool stuff, whether it's for yourself, for social media, maybe it's for a client, maybe it's for a film. I don't know what you're working on, a music video. Getting those pixels back, having even more of them with Micro Four Thirds is still, in my mind, such a huge advantage because that quality difference, the pixel peeping, I've done, you can certainly look at full frame photos and Micro Four Third photos and you can notice a little difference. There's a little bit more texture, a little bit more, something there from those pixels on the Micro Four Thirds that maybe you like it, maybe you don't. Some people prefer that kind of, I don't say grain or noise because that tends to sound bad, but the texture, people like that aesthetic. Chances are by the time it gets exported, by the time it gets uploaded, by the time it gets compressed by whatever streaming platform it's coming from, you're not even going to see that anyway. You're not going to notice the difference. It's just going to look the way it looks. And if you're worried about shallow depth of field and background bokeh, you can do all that with Micro Four Thirds. And trust me, full frame is almost too shallow for a lot of times. You're talking about doing close-up work. Full frame is a nightmare when you're trying to do close-up work because everything is out of focus. You're stopping down anyway. And if you know how to use full frame, you know how to use those lenses, you're doing that close-up work. Macro photography is another big one. So much is out of focus that you have to stop down in that aperture. And guess what? That's what Micro Four Thirds is kind of doing anyway by just containing that field of view and having less sensor total area to worry about. It's a smaller sensor, so you get more of that crop factor. And there's a lot of technical stuff that people argue, like the depth of field is actually the same, and no, it's not. In practical terms, when you're actually using these cameras, yes, full frame, if you're trying to compare apples to apples, same same lens, same aperture, like trying to do more or less the same thing, full frame is going to look shallower. It just does. Now you can argue that that's not true scientifically, technically, whatever, but in practical terms, when you're using the cameras, full frame is shallower. The depth of field appears to be shallower. But that can be a great advantage for Micro Four Thirds when you don't want that, when you're trying to do close-up work or you want to see some of the set behind you. You want to see some of that background. And yeah, I'm probably this whole time, I'm not really talking about APS-C because those cameras just don't seem to be as popular anymore. There was a time where APS-C was the more affordable budget option to full frame, but the full frame sensors are so cheap now that, let's be real, there's not a lot of people talking about crop sensors. Yes, you have people, the enthusiasts who like the Sony FX30, for example, which is a Super 35 or APS-C style sensor. So they do exist, they are out there, but it's really kind of a full frame market from my perspective. Almost all these cameras, if we look at Lumix or Canon or Sony or Nikon, they're all kind of having great, incredible, affordable full frame cameras. But I think pretty much all of them are 3x2 aspect ratio sensors. So when Micro Four Thirds is over here with 4x3, I'm sitting there going, there's still something here. There's still some value getting those extra pixels, that taller room, more extra room for vertical content. It's not maybe the deal breaker one way or the other. You know, if you want to do open gate, you can certainly do that with the Lumix full frame. But if you are someone who really has these multi-purpose, multi-format, multi-platform productions, Micro Four Thirds still is powerful. We've got stuff like the GH7, doesn't overheat. You can record almost any codec imaginable, from like RAW to ProRes. Like, there's so many flavors, so many options that you can do with the GH7. Of course, we've got 32-bit float. We've got tons of frame rate options. Yes, it is a cropped sensor, but you're only compared to full frame. Full frame is cropped compared to medium format. So it's just the size of the sensor. It is a smaller sensor, but that comes with advantages. More telephoto reach, if that's something that's of interest to you. And yes, maybe the image quality isn't as pristine as what you can get from some full frame cameras. But again, at the end of the day, when you're exporting, when you're compressing, when you're uploading, when you're doing, even with photos, even with video, all that kind of gets lost a little bit in all the translation that happens between uploading and downloading and streaming, etc. So if you want a pixel peep and you want that perfect image quality, yeah, full frame will get you that. And guess what? Medium format will get you that even more if you're working with a nice medium format camera. The bigger the sensor, yes, the image quality is more likely, chances are, going to be improved. But you don't always want bigger. You don't, if it's, a super wide, let's say they make some crazy, ridiculously wide sensor that's bigger, but it loses the ability to do open gate like we're talking about. Maybe that is a deal breaker and something you can say, I don't really care that much about that extra image quality when it hurts so much of my efficiency and my workflow when it comes to things like open gate. So something to keep in mind. I know I've been talking a lot about the S5 Mark II lately. I love the camera. It's been great, super incredible. Doesn't overheat, all the things I've said before. Awesome, awesome camera. But compared to something like the GH7, there are advantages, small, tiny ones that you wouldn't necessarily even think of on paper on a feature set. Because when these products are out there, they both can do open gate, but open gate between a full frame camera like the S5 Mark II or the S9 is different than open gate on Micro Four Thirds like the GH7 or the G9 Mark II. Just because they both do open gate doesn't mean it's the same open gate. And this is kind of a curveball that if you're used to working with Micro Four Thirds and you say, oh, I'm going to get a full frame camera. Well, now that open gate isn't quite as open, if you want to think of it. It's not as tall. It's 3x2. And it's a different style. It's a different workflow. It's a different format. If you're trying to mix and match Micro Four Thirds to full frame Lumix, both open gate, it doesn't match up like you would think, like you would want if you're doing this multi-aspect production that I think a lot of people have caught on. There's still a lot of people who don't really understand the benefit. They say, I'll keep doing 16:9. It's fine. And here they are cropping vertical content from 16:9, reframing, shooting extra wide, jumping through all these hoops, having all these hurdles or slowdown is challenges. It kills efficiency to try and shoot vertical content with 16:9. And I think a lot of people realize that, and then they start building vertical camera rigs where they're shooting vertical 16:9, and then their horizontal production is ruined because they're just not doing it at all. And then someone will ask, hey, can we get can we get a horizontal version for broadcast? Hey, can we get this horizontal version for our website? Hey, can we do... If you build a vertical camera rig, you're pretty much stuck. Like, good luck. Yes, you can creatively find ways to frame around it, but OpenGate solves all of that. It's just it's the pre-step. Again, we're uncropping the sensor. We're taking away those black bars. We're unletterboxing our sensor, our footage, and we're starting with the full sensor space. And if you're doing that with Micro Four Thirds, you are getting the most vertical resolution that I can think of from any of these professional premium cameras. I think GoPro might have a square aspect ratio sensor, maybe something close. DJI might be playing in this space. But all those cameras, those action cameras, that's still not like my go-to. That's not my A camera. That's not what I'm going to be shooting everything with. It was the GoPro. Yeah, it's helpful if you're doing action adventure type photography or video. I'm glad that they're doing it. But those waves have not made it to the higher end, more prosumer style cameras. I don't know of a professional photography video camera that has a square aspect ratio. The best that we can get is Micro Four Thirds 4x3 in terms of the most real estate in all directions that we can work with. And there are great lenses for Micro Four Thirds. The system has been around forever. We've got phase detect now. All the, autofocus criticisms of Micro Four Thirds and the Lumix cameras, those are all gone. We're past that. You've got incredible power in these Micro Four Third cameras. And if you don't need autofocus, look at something like a GH6, a GH5 even, a GH4. You can go back and get dirt cheap cameras that can do what I'm talking about. Open gate 4x3 multi-aspect production. I've been doing it for quite a while, probably almost 10 years, I think, shooting this way, getting horizontal and vertical content at the same time. It's so valuable. Every project needs some kind of, almost every project needs a social media component. I don't know the projects out there where they're like, yeah, horizontal, that's all we need. No, doesn't even, movie trailers are being posted on Instagram vertical. Hollywood productions need vertical clips for their social media. The whole trailer will be on Instagram. And if you think of that, from the biggest of the biggest movies, the most expensive productions, all the way down to influencers and content creators and people just shooting on their phones, vertical is in demand. And yet it is not the only thing we should be focused on. There's still plenty of room. I've talked about it before. VR, AR, your eyeballs are side by side. Horizontal is not going away. We see the world horizontally. Landscape, not portrait. So if you're thinking about just human biology, all the screens, all the flavors of content out there, you should be capturing content for all of them. And that's why I like open gate production. That's why I've shot with the Lumix cameras for so long, because of that few cameras that actually do that particular feature, plus all the other amazing things that we can talk about: image quality, dynamic range, color, frame rates, etc. They've been doing it so well for so long. And I'm surprised that more people don't realize these benefits. Even something like Micro Four Thirds that feels like, it's old, it's done, we're all moving on to full frame. If you want to do open gate, there's still plenty of reason to shoot Micro Four Thirds.